Dear colleagues and dear friends, tonight, Professor Timothy Williamson will give his seventh lecture. He will talk about counterfactual conditionals. Actually, present the main content of his new book, Suppose and Tell, the Heuristics of Conditionals, published by Oxford in 2019. Since Professor Williamson is well known by Chinese colleagues, so I will omit the introduction to him. Now it's the time to Professor Williams. Welcome.
Right. Thank you. So I'll share my screen first. So good. So thank you. I'm going to be talking about counterfactuals, particularly counterfactual conditionals, in this lecture. And I'll start by explaining both the general problem that I was dealing with in my 2020 book, the Suppose and Tell, Semantics and Heuristics of Conditionals, and I'll also explain some of my earlier work on conditionals. But I think that, by far the most important thing I've done on conditionals is this recent book. Within philosophy, the main debate has concerned the semantics and pragmatics of different conditional constructions in English. I mean, that's within recent analytic philosophy. In fact, this is the problem of conditionals is a quite ancient problem. The ancient Greeks were already dealing with this problem. For some reason, there a lot of the discussions of it were happening in the city of Alexandria, which was a Greek city, but actually within Egypt. And one poet wrote that even the crows on the rooftops are cawing about conditionals. It was such a popular topic. So, of course, the fact that we're now discussing them in English is just an artifact of the analytic philosophy, as where the international language of it mainly being in English these days. So, of course, you might, well, that's already a hint that it's not a local problem, but one might therefore suspect that it concerns a local problem, irrelevant to speakers of other languages, for example, Chinese. But of course, there are, in fact, there are conditionals in Chinese, and my impression from outside is that they're not so different from conditionals in English, and when one considers the cognitive roles for which conditionals are used, they seem to be relevant to speakers of any language. For example, when we're making decisions, we have to ask ourselves questions like, what would happen if I did that? So we don't actually do that to see what happens necessarily, because that might be a very dangerous thing to do. But we have to ask ourselves these conditional questions, and depending on the answers we give to them, we choose one course of action rather than another. And that seems to be a kind of problem that faces any any intelligent human being, in fact, probably any kind of intelligent animal at all, it would seem in some way has to deal with conditionals. But at any rate, we're going to be concerned with conditionals for humans. And so it actually seems likely that roughly the same basic distinctions are drawn by conditionals in any human language, but perhaps in different ways. And it's an interesting question how much variation there is. So some linguists have done comparative work on conditionals, studying how they work across many languages. And on the whole, as I understand it, the evidence seems to support the hypothesis that we're dealing with, as it were, some basic conditional distinctions, and they're going to be in any human natural language. But of course, the exact way in which these conditional constructions are implemented in different languages can vary, quite a bit from one language to another. And so I'm going to discuss the problem in relation to English, but I'm conjecture that similar issues would arise for any other natural language, though the details might be different. And that's the methodology that many philosophers use in this approaching conditionals, whereas the linguists are more likely to be making the comparative studies. So the first thing on this topic that I want to explain is a difference between two kinds of conditional sentence. Exactly what the difference is and how it comes about a controversial matter. So I will be giving my view later. But there are examples, there's which seem to make it clear that there are two quite different kinds of conditionals, even though they seem to be, as it were, about, if you put them, just were to formalize them as if X, then Y, the X and Y would be the same. So there's a very famous example of this, which was devised by the philosopher Ernest Adams, who gave an example about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy by Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963. So in English, there are two things that we can say which sound very, very similar. One is if Oswald did not shoot Kennedy, someone else did. The second is if Oswald had not shot Kennedy, someone else would have. But despite the superficial extreme similarity between these, they actually have quite different meanings. So all you need in order to assert one is to know that someone shot Kennedy. That's enough, because if it wasn't Oswald who shot him, it was someone else. So one, as it were, is very easy to assert just on the basis of very simple historical knowledge about what actually happened. But that knowledge is not sufficient for asserting two. To assert sentence two, you would need to know, for example, that there was a second backup assassin waiting further down the road to shoot Kennedy if Oswald failed, or perhaps you might know that Kennedy's style made him someone who was sooner or later bound to be assassinated, or something like that. That would be an alternative reason for asserting two. But two very much does not follow from just the fact that someone shot Kennedy. So despite the similarity between these sentences, they're saying something quite different, and it could easily be that sentence 1 is true while sentence 2 is false. And one way of putting this kind of cognitive difference between them, is that one seems to be talking about what happened in the actual world. So if it's certain that Oswald shot Kennedy, one seems irrelevant, because if we're certain that Oswald did shoot Kennedy, what's the point in talking about what happened if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy? But 2 seems to be talking about what happened in a counterfactual world. So even though it's certain that Oswald shot Kennedy, let's assume, because we're not going for any conspiracy theories, 2 still seems relevant, because its truth or falsity is not settled by the mere historical fact that Oswald shot Kennedy. So conditional like 1 are they're called indicative conditionals, whereas those like sentence 2 are called subjunctive or counterfactual conditionals. So there are some ways in which this terminology is a bit misleading, but it's standard. So I won't, as it were, invent some new terminology for this, but I mean, one reason why this. So somebody, I think, needs to turn their.
你那个把那个关了，那个声音，你那里有一些 noise。Yes, okay, good.
Yes, so there isn't really a proper subjunctive tense in English, so that's bad terminology, and I could explain it possibly later, but why the counterfactual is also a somewhat misleading term, but these are the standard terms to use, so we'll still use them. So some philosophers defend the material reading of indicative conditionals. So, but well, I didn't put him here, but Bertrand Russell assumed that then that Paul Grice, David Lewis, and I defend it in my my book. So when I say the truth table reading of indicative conditionals, that's the one that you get in elementary logic textbooks, and it's one where the conditional if X, then Y. It's false if X is true and Y is false, and it's true in any other case. And so that's certainly the simplest view of conditionals. But this interpretation of the indicative conditional is currently quite unpopular, and because there are definitely some data which are very problematic for it, and so you might think, looking at the data, that the view is hopeless. I mean, I think it can in fact be defended, but it's clear that there are some difficult challenges for it to overcome. So here's an example that we can consider, which is, so supposing that you bought a lottery ticket, maybe it's a lottery with a million tickets and only one of them wins, and then consider the statement, which is just an ordinary indicative conditional. It's not this counterfactual conditional, but if the ticket won, it lost, and then ask yourself, well, how probable is that conditional statement 3? And I think most people will react that that's a crazy statement, and they would say, hey, that's completely wrong. And And so if you were giving it a probability, it would be quite natural to say that it actually has probability 0. If it won, it didn't lose. But if you give it the material truth, the truth functional reading, then 3 turns out to be almost certainly true. For it's almost certain that its antecedent, the ticket 1, is false, because this is just one ticket in a lottery with maybe 1 million tickets. So it's almost certain that it did not win, and so the antecedent, the ticket 1, is almost certainly false. And if a material conditional has a false antecedent, then it's true. If the ticket did not win, then sentence 3 is true on the material truth functional reading. So it seems that on that reading predicts that 3 is almost certainly true, and that's at first sight that is a really crazy result. That what seems like a very bad conditional like 3 is almost certainly true. So that's you can elaborate these kinds of examples a lot. There are many examples of roughly this type, but that's a sort of an extreme case with things look really bad for the truth functional material reading of the indicative conditional. And what seems to be going on there when we assess the probability of an indicative conditional is that what we're doing is we seem to be doing something like looking at the probability of its consequent conditional on its antecedent. So in this case, we're looking at what's the probability that the ticket lost given or conditional on the ticket 1. And of course, the answer to that question is 0. Given that it lost, it didn't win. That's certain. And so, using that method of assessment of the probability of an indicative conditional, you will get the answer that 3 has probability 0. And so that seems to be at least roughly what's going on when we assess sentence 3 as having probability 0. Now, the trouble with that is that if you just equate the probability of a conditional with the corresponding conditional probability, if you just take that equation in general for all conditionals, all indicative conditionals, it actually generates inconsistencies in situations which have 3 or more open possibilities. Roughly speaking, situations where you're dealing with at least 3 epistemically possible worlds, 3 possible worlds that for all you know, are the actual world. And I mean, the first person who proved results along these lines was David Lewis. And so what I argue in my book is that our tendency to make that equation, roughly speaking, of the probability of a conditional with the corresponding conditional probability, that can be explained by our reliance on a useful but imperfectly reliable, and in fact, in these types of situation, inconsistent heuristic for assessing conditionals. I'm not going to go into the details of the inconsistency proof. I mean, it's not very difficult, in fact, to prove these things, but I don't think now is the best time just for going into the technical details. But And I should say that David Lewis's proof has some slightly controversial assumptions, but I think most of those can be avoided. And so we seem to be having quite a general result here. That as it were, if you look at where our judgment that 3 is certainly false, that conditional sentence is certainly false, where that judgment is coming from, it seems to be coming from this heuristic for assessing probabilities of conditionals. And the heuristic actually seems to be inconsistent in situations where there are more than 3 open possibilities. And of course, in most situations, where there are 3 or more open possibilities. Most situations are like that. As any situation in which you're throwing dice. I mean, a die can come up six ways. There are 6 open possibilities. So this test that we use is closely related to what is often in the literature called the Ramsey test on the basis of Ramsey, but I call it the suppositional test. It's not exactly the same as what Ramsey says, but it's very closely related to it, which is a very general kind of rule for how to assess a conditional. So it's saying if you want to assess a conditional, we're talking about indicative conditionals at the moment, of the form if A then C, you assess the consequent C on the supposition A. You suppose or imagine A, and then under that supposition or imagination, you ask, well, what's the status of C? Is it true? Is it false? Is it probable? Is it improbable? And then you make an assessment on the supposition, but then you transfer that assessment outside the supposition and make it an assessment of the conditional if A then C. And I think there's a lot of evidence that it's not the only way that we can assess conditionals, but that needs to be something like the basic way of assessing conditionals. So it's a very, very simple rule. And so that fact that about how a sentence like 3 seems to be completely improbable, to have probability 0. It's actually explained on the assumption that we're using the suppositional test, because in that case, if we're asked how probable it is, the assessment that we're making is an assessment of probability. And if you assess the C, which in this case is it lost, on the supposition A, which is it won, you get the answer 0. And then using the suppositional test, you would transfer that assessment to the conditional. If the ticket won, it lost, and you'd get the result that the probability of the conditional is 0. And then, as I say, what the implication is that we're getting these estimates of probability on the basis of a test which is not completely reliable, because it can lead to inconsistent results. And therefore, the appearance of a counterexample to the truth functional material reading, you can't really take it at face value, because it may well be explained by our psychological use of an unreliable test. Now, so that's some discussion of the situation with indicative conditionals. But now, as well, the corresponding to sentence 1 about the Kennedy assassination. But now we need to go on to counterfactual conditionals, and the material truth functional reading is generally agreed to be wrong for them, and I agree with that. That it's in general wrong for counterfactual conditionals. I think it what's pretty clear is that if the material reading is right for any natural language conditionals. It's right for indicative conditionals, which are clearly different from counterfactual conditionals. So if it's right for them, it's not going to be right for the counterfactual conditionals, because then we wouldn't get this big difference between them. So the usual semantic approach to counterfactual conditionals is one which uses possible worlds. And that approach follows the work of Robert Stalnaker in 1968 and David Lewis in 1973, which have become a bit less amongst linguists, but amongst philosophers have become the kind of the sort of standard view of counterfactual conditionals. And you remember that when we were looking at the counterfactual conditional, if Oswald had not shot Kennedy, someone else would have, that seemed in some sense to be talking about a counterfactual world, a world other than the actual world that we're in. In saying that, so because in the actual world we know that Oswald did shoot Kennedy, but we can still, given that, we can still ask about, well, but what would have happened if Oswald had not shot Kennedy? And so it's quite natural to use the apparatus of possible worlds once you have it, to try to understand what's happening with counterfactual conditionals. And then different people use different notations, but the notation that David Lewis uses is this box arrow notation. If it were that A, it would be that C, and he uses it to convey that that the counterfactual conditional has got some modal element, like a necessity operator, but also some implication element, like an ordinary indicative conditional. It's somehow a combination of the two. But he treats it as a single operator. So the box and the arrow, they're meant. That's really meant to be an atomic symbol for David Lewis, even though it's also meant to remind you of the box for necessity and the arrow for the ordinary conditional. And the kind of general idea which Stalnaker and Lewis have is that the counterfactual conditional, if A were the case, then C would be the case. It's true at a world W, if and only if C is true at the closest worlds to W at which A is true. Right. So typically A will be a world where we'll be considering a world W where A is not true, but then we look at the worlds which are in some sense to be explained, we are the closest to it where A is true, and then we ask, well, is C true at those worlds? So the sentence 2 that we were looking at, if Oswald had not shot Kennedy, someone else would have. It's true at our world, the actual world, if and only if someone else shoots Kennedy at the closest world to ours at which Oswald does not shoot Kennedy. And so that just displaying the semantics again. Lewis later gave an elaborate account of what kind of closeness or similarity is relevant to counterfactual conditionals, because not all kinds of similarity give you the right results if you use them to interpret closeness. But he thought that if you study the way we use counterfactual conditionals, you can see what kind of similarity we are using, and that will give you and then if you interpret closeness in terms of that kind of similarity, then that will give you the right results. I'm not going to go into the details about that, but that was his general approach. Stalnaker was a little bit different from Lewis he applied the same basic semantics to both indicative and counterfactual conditionals, and he differentiated them by the relevant kind of closeness, and he thought of that as something that was really, in effect, supplied by the context, what kind of closeness you were looking at. Another important difference between Lewis and Stalnaker is that Stalnaker built it into his semantics that there's always a unique closest world to W at which A is true. And that has some significant effects on the logic of conditionals for Stalnaker. So, for example, if we're throwing a die which can come up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, then let's suppose that in the actual world it comes up 6. Then, for Lewis, the worlds where it comes up 1, worlds where it comes up 2, worlds where it comes up 3, worlds where it comes up 4, worlds where it comes up 5, those can all be equally close worlds to the actual world. And so for the counterfactual, for some counterfactual about those worlds, if it hadn't come up 6, you just look at all of those worlds. Whereas for Stalnaker, on any particular application of the semantics, you have to pick one world as the closest. But he allows that there might not be any kind of determinate matter of fact as to which world that is, where it would have come up if it hadn't come up 6. One thing that's going to be important in what follows is that Stalnaker and Lewis agree that if A is impossible, then the counterfactual conditional is true. So to put the same point in other terminology, they agree that counterpossibles are vacuously true. That's something that's been challenged by more recent philosophers, but not including me. But that's something that Stalnaker and Lewis agree on. Now, I'll just go back and say a little bit about how I started working on conditionals. So my first research on conditionals was published as an article called Bivalence and Subjunctive Conditionals. Remember, subjunctive conditionals is used as more or less interchangeable with counterfactual conditionals. This was an article published in 1988. So it was opposing the argument of my old teacher, Michael Dummett, that bivalence, the principle of bivalence, fails for counterfactual conditionals. So in other words, that counterfactual conditionals can be neither true nor false. But the key move in Dummett's argument was that he took it that the falsity of the counterfactual conditional, if A were the case, C would be the case, that it must be equated with the truth of the kind of opposite counterfactual conditional, that if A were the case, then C would not have been the case. So, for example, if the die had been thrown, it would have come up 6, is false if and only if the die had been thrown, it would not have come up 6, is true. So he made that assumption, so that in effect, negating a counterfactual conditional is equivalent to negating its consequent. And so any case where neither A counterfactually implies C nor A counterfactually implies not C, where that's going to be a case where A counterfactually implies C is neither true nor false, given Dummett's assumption. So So, for example, you might think that if the die had not come up, this example, if the die had been thrown, it would have come up 6. That's not true. But also, if the die had been thrown, it would not have come up 6. That's not true either. It's just because it's just nothing is fixed about how it would have come up. And so that might be a case when the counterfactual conditional, if the die had been thrown, it would have come up 6, is neither true nor false. Now, in response, I argue that the falsity of A counterfactually implies C is not equivalent to the truth of A counterfactually implies not C, because the negation of the counterfactual conditional is not equivalent to just negating its consequent. And I think that what I said there was basically right. I mean, certainly Dummett did not really give any argument for saying that the falsity of a counterfactual conditional had to be understood in that way. But what I now find most interesting is why Dummett assumed that the falsity of if A were the case, C would be the case, must be equated with the truth if A were the case, not C would be the case. And my conjecture is that what he was doing was in effect relying on an analog of the suppositional test for counterfactual conditionals, and one which I discuss in Suppose and Tell, so that assessing the counterfactual conditional, if A were the case, not C would be the case, as true, is equated with assessing not C as true and so C as false on the counterfactual supposition of A, which is equated with assessing A counterfactual, if A were the case, C would be the case, as false by another application of the counterfactual suppositional test. One thing I should add here is that the original suppositional test I was talking about was for indicative conditionals, but I think there's some kind of slightly subtler analog of it for counterfactual conditionals. And I explain in the book, how you can derive one of these from the other. And so I think that although Dummett went wrong, he went wrong because he was responding to, he was following a genuine aspect of a standard way of assessing counterfactual conditionals, which is by using a counterfactual version of the suppositional test. And so he went wrong by relying on our primary but fallible heuristic for assessing conditionals. In other words, he was misled by trusting what is indeed our basic way of testing counterfactual conditionals. It's just that way is not really fully reliable. Another way in which my earlier work engaged with counterfactual conditionals, and this was important for how I eventually came to write my conditionals book, is the counterfactual conditionals also played a significant role in the development of my anti-exceptionalist approach in the philosophy of philosophy, my approach to philosophy, which treats it as not really using specifically, as it were, philosophical cognitive faculties or anything like that, but just using our quite ordinary cognitive faculties but in fairly systematic ways. And so, I wanted to show that our knowledge, in particular of metaphysical modality, of metaphysical necessity and possibility, is not a mysterious, isolated phenomenon, but simply a byproduct of something much more familiar, which is our use of counterfactual conditionals, which will be used in all sorts of everyday situations. And of course, we may use them in science as well. So an interesting aspect of the Stalnaker-Lewis approach, which Stalnaker himself noticed, is that it allows us to characterize metaphysical necessity in terms of counterfactuals. So on their views, saying that A is metaphysically necessary is equivalent to saying that not A counterfactually implies A. That if not A were the case, A would still be the case, which seems a bit paradoxical, but when you work out how their semantics applies to such cases, you realize that's the case, because if A is necessary, then not A is impossible, and so since all counterpossibles on their view are, or counterpossible conditionals, they're all true. So if A is impossible, then if not A is impossible, then not A counterfactually implies A. And just for a very similar reason, possibly A is equivalent to it's not the case that A counterfactually implies not A. And actually, this point that you can capture metaphysical modality in terms of a counterfactual conditional. I already used this point in discussion as far back as 1986, actually at a conference, to argue for anti-exceptionalism about metaphysical modality, that we should not regard it as some kind of weird thing which philosophers have invented and it's terribly mysterious and so on, because it's actually definable in something in terms of something very, very familiar, which are counterfactual conditionals. Of course, there are mysteries about exactly how counterfactual conditionals work, or problems, but what's clear is that we just in ordinary life and in science and so on, we make a lot of use of counterfactual conditionals. So this is not some just kind of isolated philosophical thing. These are things which are kind of built into our use of these ordinary counterfactual conditionals. That if you look at these particular ones, I mean, they're slightly weird looking, but their meaning is kind of generated just by the ordinary semantics for counterfactual conditionals. Then that already gives us a way of getting a grip on metaphysical modality, metaphysical possibility, and necessity. So what that implies is that a cognitive apparatus which is adequate for dealing with counterfactual conditionals should also be adequate for dealing with metaphysical modality, because metaphysical modality is not really something fundamentally new. It's something that, as it were, is already in effect available to us from our use of counterfactual conditionals. And since counterfactual conditionals play a large role, for example, in our causal thinking and decision making, we should not expect anything exceptional to be involved in cognition of metaphysical modality. So, for example, with causation, when we're interested in whether lighting a match caused the building to burn down, we often want to consider, well, what would have happened if we had not lit the match? And that's a counterfactual conditional. So that's an important connection between causal thinking and counterfactual conditional thinking. And in decision making, actually, one particular aspect that's important is when we come to look back on our decisions, and sometimes we regret our decisions, and we were saying, things like, if I had chosen differently, then things would have worked out better. And that's also a counterfactual conditional, because of course I didn't choose differently. And those kind of regrets that we can have, they're not just emotional, they're actually something that we can use in learning from experience and learning from our mistakes. And so that's one specific role of counterfactual conditionals. So those are examples of the way in which counterfactual conditionals are important to, non-philosophical, serious thinking about the world. So, as I already mentioned, the account where you define metaphysical necessity and possibility in terms of these slightly odd counterfactuals, the equivalence actually does depend on the vacuous truth of counterpossibles. So, the counterfactuals with impossible antecedents. In particular, if necessarily A entails, if not A were the case, then A would be the case, then what's going on is that the impossibility of not A, which is equivalent to the necessity of A, makes it counterfactually, makes not A counterfactually imply its own contradictory. So that principle about the vacuous truth of counterpossibles is really important for these equivalencies which I was using. And so some resistance to my account came from philosophers who denied the vacuous truth of counterpossibles, even though it was built into the standard approach to the semantics of counterpossibles. And so here's an example of where they would have denied the vacuous truth of counterpossibles. So these philosophers would accept sentence 4, that necessarily Hesperus is phosphorus, because Hesperus is phosphorus. These are both just names for the evening star, but in other words, the planet Venus. But they also accepted Kripke's argument, following Ruth Buck and Marcus, for the necessity of identity, and so where you have an identity just between using names, that if it's true, then it's necessarily the case. And so they took Hesperus as phosphorus to be necessary, and therefore it's impossible that Hesperus is not phosphorus. But if you look at the counterfactual conditional, if Hesperus were not phosphorus, Hesperus would be phosphorus, which on the view that I was defending is actually that 5 is actually equivalent to 4. They would reject 5, and I think their idea in rejecting 5 was that, although Hesperus not being phosphorus is metaphysically impossible, that doesn't mean that it implies a contradiction, which it would do. But if it also implied that Hesperus was phosphorus, because they would say, that may be contrary to metaphysical fact, but it's not logically impossible that Hesperus is not phosphorus. It's not logic that tells us that they're distinct. That would be their kind of explanation for why they would reject the counterpossible 5. And so on the view of these philosophers, 4 and 5 were not really equivalent, and so that would undermine the kind of account that I was giving of metaphysical necessity in terms of a counterfactual conditional, such as 5. Now, when you examine this kind of objection closer, you see that it is actually quite problematic. And so in fact, the example illustrates the difficulties in implementing the kind of approach that these philosophers take semantically. Because if names are directly referential, in other words, if their semantic role is simply to pick out the objects, to refer to the objects that they're names of, then co-referential names such as Hesperus and Phosphorus, they're actually synonymous. It's not simply that they have the same reference, but that they have the same meaning in the relevant sense, because the only meaning of a name is its reference. And I mean, that's it's not, uncontroverted, but that's a very widespread view in the philosophy of language. And so 6 should imply 7. If Hesperus were not Phosphorus, Hesperus would not be Phosphorus, which of course is completely trivial, to if Hesperus were not Phosphorus, Hesperus would not be Hesperus, where I simply substituted the name Hesperus for the name Phosphorus in 6. But you'd expect that substitution to work, because I've just substituted one synonymous term for another. And you can make this kind of argument with any two pairs of synonymous terms. And so 6 and 7, they're both counterpossibles, but 7 does involve some contravention of logic, because it's denying that something is identical with itself. And so if you take that kind of line where you deny that an impossibility, like if Hesperus not being Phosphorus, where you deny that involves any logical contradiction, you get into trouble with a very widespread view of proper names. And in fact, we could also make the same argument using other expressions which are synonymous, but are, for example, with natural kind terms and other examples. So I think that this view, the view that I oppose, on which counterpossibles are sometimes true, it has serious problems. But my opponents typically want to retain a world-based semantic framework for counterfactuals, but to allow impossible as well as possible worlds. And so their strategy is, in the semantics, is that even when A is impossible, they can still falsify the counterfactual conditional, if A were the case, C would be the case, by using an impossible world where A is true and C is false. And so then on the world semantics, that as long as it's close enough to the actual world, that can falsify. If A were the case, then C would be the case. And so, as it were, even when we have a counterpossible, there are always some worlds where the antecedent will be true. It's just on this kind of alternative semantics, these will be impossible worlds rather than possible worlds. Now, what you usually get with this kind of approach, that, as I say, the approach that I'm opposing, but in such a framework, any set of sentences counts as a world. And if you just take a set of sentences as a world, then the idea is, well, all the sentences in that set are true of that world, and no other sentences are true of that world. So they just need a set of sentences which contains A but not C. So, I mean, there always is such a set, unless A and C are actually the very same sentence. That's the only case where they're going to have a problem, but that's a very special case, of course. So I want to explain a couple of problems for impossible world semantics. So the first is related to what I've already said. It's that it's inconsistent with a principle central to contemporary semantics, which is compositionality. So semantic compositionality says that the meaning of a complex expression is determined by the meanings of its constituents and how they're put together. So that's a very general sort of guiding principle, which really goes back to Frege. How it's implemented depends on the details of the semantics, but that is something that, as a guiding principle, which has been central to the way that modern semantics has developed. And the point of this is that this is what enables speakers to understand new sentences. It's because the meaning of these new sentences, which they've never heard before, is determined by the meanings of for example, the words in them and the way those words are put together syntactically. So the impossible world semantics violates this. So, for example, if you're looking at a particular model within this framework, then the meaning of a sentence will be, roughly speaking, the set of worlds where that sentence is true, and because of the way that this semantics is done, sentences A1 and A2, they may be exactly the same semantically. So in other words, they have the same meaning, while not A1 and not A2 differ semantically. And you could just do this by the way that you select the worlds to go into, which worlds go into the model. And so not even negation behaves compositionally, because for example, the meaning of not A1 isn't determined by the meaning of negation and the meaning of the sentence A1, because if it were, then it would be the same. It would have the same meaning as not A2, because A1 and A2 have the same meaning. But that's not what you get in the semantics. So there's a failure of semantic compositionality. The second problem that I want to raise for impossible worlds semantics is methodological, and in brief, I think impossible world semantics is basically bad science. But let me explain what I have in mind about that. So by allowing a model to have an arbitrary sets of sentences as its set of worlds, because these arbitrary sets of sentences, those just are these impossible or occasionally possible worlds in that framework. The impossible world semantics, it massively increases the model's degrees of freedom. So when we talk about degrees of freedom in science, that means the number of mutually independent parameters that you have, and so when you have in these impossible worlds, you have much more freedom in how you set up a model, because with each world you could make whatever you like be true in a given world just by selecting those sentences and no others to be true, and so it's very different from what you get in standard possible world semantics, where, for example, the whether not A is true at a world is just determined by whether A is true at that world, but because of the rule for negation. Now, you might think, well, oh, it's great to have all these degrees of freedom. Isn't freedom a good thing? But in scientific modeling, it's generally recognized that it is methodologically vital to restrict the model's degrees of freedom drastically, to keep it as low as possible, because otherwise fitting the data becomes too easy. And that results in loss of explanatory power. So in effect, what we have is that impossible world semantics is unexplanatory, because you can fit pretty much any data you like. You can just rather trivially fit with such if you have too many degrees of freedom. And in scientific terms, what you actually get is a problem of what's called overfitting, where the model sticks too close to the data, and one typical effect of overfitting is that you don't have a stable model, because every time you get new data, you have to change your model to fit that, and that's really, scientific experience shows that that's a bad approach. That it's much better to have really simple models, which may not explain the given data quite so well, but that's not too bad, because the given data, there may be errors in the given data, and these are models which are robust in the sense that you don't have to change them every time you get new data. They may just be confirmed by the new data, and so the scientific experience is that the robust strategy is to go for simple models with few degrees of freedom, few independent parameters, and that's what it makes it more difficult to fit any given data, but you get more robust and explanatory models. And I think it's that the impossible world semantics is basically forgetting about that kind of scientific methodology, and is just going for this shallow overfitting strategy. So that's why I think that impossible world semantics is as a form of natural language semantics is actually a bad science. So the third problem that I want to raise for impossible world semantics is that it's motivated by an uncritical attitude to the data. So, an intuitive judgment of the falsity of a particular counterpossible is treated as providing a decisive counterexample to the vacuous truth of counterpossibles, like the example about Hesperus and Phosphorus, with no reflection on how the judgment might have been generated. And I think more specifically, the potential role of fallible heuristics in generating the judgment is not considered. And so I think there's something methodologically naive about the way in which the impossible world semantics treats data. It just it takes these as decisive counterexamples, and then explains them in this very shallow way that I was talking about, and the idea that we might have to question some of our data is not really considered. And of course, obviously in doing natural language semantics, we need to have data. We can't do it just by being completely skeptical about all our data right from the beginning. But we have to take into account the possibility that sometimes what data which look good may in fact embody some kind of errors of, as it were, observation. And I think that particularly the difficulties that semanticists and philosophers have had in finding effective theories of conditionals that fit the data, that's some evidence that we might need to be more critical about our data. So just going back to how my own thinking about these matters developed, the debate on whether counterpossibles are vacuously true, it alerted me to the potential role of fallible heuristics in generating semantic data in some sense. So it seemed to me that the reason people were coming up with these judgments was I explained that initially by a much more specific heuristic, that if C is inconsistent with D, then if A were the case, C would be the case, is inconsistent with if A were the case, D would be the case. So this rule, which I've called, or heuristic, which I've called INC, I was treating that as the relevant heuristic, that we were using this rule. And so, if you have that rule, INC, and an apparently true counterpossible, if A were the case, then C would be the case, then you can construct an apparent counterexample to the vacuous truth of counterpossibles, because you just pick some D which is inconsistent with C, and then look at if A were the case, D would be the case, and then that's going to seem false because of the inconsistency between C and D. So once you've got this heuristic, it's very easy to construct apparent counterexamples to the vacuous truth of counterpossibles. But INC, I later realized, is just a special case of a more general heuristic, which transfers assessments of sentences under any counterfactual supposition A, possible or impossible, to the same assessments outside that supposition of the corresponding counterfactual conditionals with antecedent A. So that's basically a version of the suppositional test that I talked about, but in some subtle ways you have to do things a bit differently if you're making a counterfactual supposition. But even if you just look at INC, if you don't worry about the more general heuristic, you can actually see that it can't be 100% correct. And I mean, a simple proof of that is just what happens when you look at counterfactuals with a contradiction as the antecedent, because, so A and not A, that clearly counterfactually implies A, and it also counterfactually implies not A. And so those counterfactuals are both clearly true, that a conjunction counterfactually implies its conjuncts. But since A is inconsistent with not A, just by this heuristic INC, that would imply that A and not A counterfactually implies A is inconsistent with A and not A counterfactually implies not A. But then that's wrong, because they're both true. So even this very restricted heuristic, just for which has to do with the inconsistency of consequence, is actually, when you think about all the cases, in fact, it's inconsistent with what I take it to be very clear data, and so something is already going wrong there. So when I'm appealing to what I'm calling heuristics, these fallible heuristics, they're well recognized in psychology, but not so much in semantics. I think that's a problem for semantics. So just to give you some examples which don't have to do with semantics, I mean, the visual system uses color boundaries as a guide to the shapes of three-dimensional objects. And the kind of camouflage that is used in war to hide things from airplanes or on the ground, the camouflage exploits the fallibility of that heuristic. Camouflage is specifically the kind of patterns of it is specifically designed to mislead a human observer about what they're seeing. And more generally, perceptual illusions result from fallible heuristics. I mean, that's really why psychologists are particularly psychologists of perception, they're so interested in perceptual illusions, because the perceptual illusions, they tell us something about what heuristics the visual or other perceptual system is relying on. And they show what the limitations of those heuristics are. I mean, they're the cases where we have the perceptual illusions, where things appear to be other than what they in fact are. Those are showing up ways in which the heuristics are fallible. And I mean, in general, from the psychological point of view, these heuristics are sometimes called fast and frugal. I mean, they don't use much energy, or cheap and dirty ways of solving cognitive problems. So they're reliable enough to be useful, especially in normal cases, but they cut corners in order to be fast and cheap, and so they're not 100% reliable. And one important aspect of heuristics is that we often rely on heuristics without awareness that we're doing so. And the case of the visual system is a typical example of that, because when we see things and sometimes are subject to visual illusions, we're not really aware that we're using heuristics which can lead us astray until we come across some puzzling case. And even when the kind of illusion that psychologists are interested in, and even when we come across such visual illusions, we often don't know, just as ordinary observers, we don't know why we're being misled. We don't understand what's going on. So heuristics are typically operating below the level of consciousness. This can be a source of error when we assess sample sentences, even with respect to a clearly specified situation. So, even when we've got in semantics, when we've got a particular sentence, and then we're asked, well, look, would this sentence be true or false in such and such a counterfactual, such an imaginary scenario? We may still be using a heuristic to answer that question, and so sometimes in the problem cases we may be giving incorrect answers to the question. So one main use of a suppositional heuristic for assessing conditionals. So this is really to explain why the suppositional test is actually quite a good test in general, even though it's not 100% reliable, is that it enables us to apply our predictive capacities, calibrated online in perception, offline in imagination, to anticipate consequences. So often we've got some kind of predictive capacities, which are kind of cognitive habits, if you like, which we've learned from experience of the world, but we can use them in imagination as well, which is the kind of offline case, whereas perception is the online case. To predict what the consequences of something would be, and so we're getting a counterfactual conditional. So, for example, if I imagine, in a reality-oriented way, not just on the basis of kind of, fantasizing, to write some kind of nonsense poem. If I imagine in a reality-oriented way, trying to jump a stream in front of me, supposing that under that imaginative supposition, I predict that I will fall in. So I'm using the same kind of predictive capacities that I use directly, when I, if I try to jump thing and then I, as I'm trying to jump, I predict that I'm going to fall in. Then I can use those offline as well and make predictions. And so, so applying the suppositional test, I judge if I try to jump the stream, I would fall in. And therefore, I decide not to try to jump the stream, and I keep dry. Whereas, so this is a way in which we can, as it were, not have to learn by mistakes, but we can avoid the mistakes once we've got a certain amount of experience. And the suppositional heuristic is valuable for exactly that kind of thing. Because it is extracting conditionally expressed information from our cognitive capacities. And so we're getting, if I try to jump the stream, I would fall in, which is exactly what I need to know in order to decide not to try to jump the stream. So all our complex theoretical uses of conditionals, for instance, in mathematics and logic, they all originate from such well, sorry, there's a misprint here. I said simple theoretical uses, but I meant simple practical uses of conditionals. That, as it were, from an evolutionary perspective, we have conditionals because conditional thinking and conditional talking, because they help us to solve these practical problems. But then the conditional can also be used in more theoretical ways in mathematics and logic. So one thing I want to do just in the final part of the lecture is to explain something that you may be wondering about, which is I haven't yet explained how I differentiate counterfactual conditionals from indicative conditionals. And we know from examples that they're significantly different. So the two sentences, 1 and 2, about the Kennedy assassination, they showed that we must have some way of separating indicative and counterfactual conditionals, that they work in really significantly different ways. And in English, I think the clue is in the word would. If Oswald had not shot Kennedy, someone else would have. That's a big clue that we're dealing with a counterfactual conditional rather than an ordinary indicative conditional. And now, grammatically, the word would in English, it's just the past tense of the word will. So a historian might write of Napoleon when he was sailing off in his final exile. He would never see France again. So when Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815, the British took him away to an island in the middle of the Atlantic so that he couldn't cause any more trouble. And so the historian is writing in the past tense about Napoleon sailing off in 1815 from France, and the historian is using the past of will because he's saying the same thing, but in the past tense that would have been said at the time by saying Napoleon will never see France again. So that's where the word would comes from, as it were. But the word would is often used as what linguists call a fake past to indicate modal rather than temporal distance. So 9 is stronger than 8. So 8 is just an ordinary past tense. Mary never betrayed a friend. Whereas 9, Mary would never have betrayed a friend, is saying something stronger. That 8 is just generalizing over past times in the actual world, whereas 9 is generalizing to past times in counterfactual worlds as well. So it's adding a modal element to 8. So in that case, would is not being used as an ordinary tense expression. It's being used to convey modality. So, I mean, obviously, when you say something like Mary would never have betrayed a friend, you're not generalizing over all metaphysically possible worlds. You're only generalizing over worlds, for example, where Mary's character is the same as in the actual world. Those are the only relevant ones. So it's just you're holding Mary's character constant, even though, of course, if she'd been brought up in a different way, she might well have behaved differently. But you're holding her character constant. You say she would never have betrayed a friend, that her actual character would have prevented her from betraying a friend. And so you're just generalizing over a subset of possible worlds. And so, in effect, the word would in that kind of use, it's a local necessity operator restricted to a range of contextually relevant worlds. Now, what's happening with counterfactual sorry, it says conditions, but it should be, say, conditionals. Counterfactual conditionals combine the local necessity operator would with, I argued earlier, the material conditional, if, as in 10. So remember that I said that the material conditional, I think, is actually the best semantics for the material reading, the truth functional reading, is best semantics for the indicative conditional, even though there seem to be counterexamples, because the counterexamples are generated by the suppositional test, which is not totally reliable. And I think this is something I haven't argued today, but I think one can give some argument that that despite the apparent mismatches, it's really the material truth functional conditional which is the best fit to the information that's actually being passed about when you use indicative conditionals. But I haven't tried to establish that today. So if we look at the sample counterfactual conditional that we were talking about before, if Oswald had not shot Kennedy, someone else would have. What I argue is that the intended structure is as in 10 star. So inside we've got an indicative conditional. If Oswald did not shoot Kennedy, someone else would. And then we're applying the modal operator would to that truth functional conditional. And so the meaning is that in all contextually relevant worlds where Oswald did not shoot Kennedy, someone else did. And when, of course, when 10 is uttered, the contextually relevant worlds will normally include some in which Oswald did not shoot Kennedy, because if you utter 10, then of course our interest is in worlds where Oswald doesn't shoot Kennedy, and so even if they weren't contextually relevant before, the utterance of 10 will make some worlds like that contextually relevant, and so we could formalize A counterfactually implies C as the box with a subscript R of A arrow C. So there, the arrow is just the material truth functional conditional, and the R is that subscript is indicating that there's a contextual restriction on the metaphysical modality. So that's the account of counterfactual conditionals as which I defend in the book, and as contextually restricted strict conditionals. And I think it has several advantages over those of Stalnaker and Lewis, and two particular advantages. One is that it's semantically compositional, because it actually derived from the separate contributions of would and if, which is not something that philosophers had really been doing. They were not really thinking about what the contribution of would was by itself, and forgetting that the word would doesn't only appear as modifying if. It has a life of its own, even in sentences which don't contain a conditional. So that's the semantic compositionality I think is one advantage of the account that I'm giving. It, as it were, it looks into the microstructure of conditionals and of counterfactual conditionals, and explains where their truth conditions come from. And the second thing that is a great advantage is that it greatly simplifies the logic of conditionals. I mean, I haven't talked about that here, but you get a much, much simpler and nicer logic when you treat them as restricted, strict conditionals. And so I finished the lecture with just the question: how do counterfactual conditionals work in Chinese, and in particular in Mandarin, but also other forms of Chinese, because as I understand it, they are present in Chinese as in any other human natural language, but of course we wouldn't expect them to take exactly the form that they they take in English. And of course, that's not a question that I can answer, but it's a question that you might like to think about yourselves. And so I'll stop there. I think I've been talking for long enough. Thank you. And and I will stop sharing now. We can't hear you. Tempo, your microphone is muted.
Oh, yes. Okay, sir. Yes. Thanks to Professor Williamson's interesting talk. Maybe for some CHEN clingers, the topic counterfactual is not so easy to follow. But if you can get roughly picture, it's okay. Now, I do a very short introduction to polite interlocutor, Professor Song Qinghui. Professor Song Qinghui comes from Taiwan. He got his PhD from Zhongzhen University in Taiwan. His supervisor is Professor Wang Wenfang. Now they are clingers at the Shandong University. Song Qinghui, his work, his research focuses especially on conditionals, modality, and vagueness, very close to the field of Professor Williamson. Song Qinghui's recent publications can be found in Journal of Philosophical Research and some journals, Philosophy and Culture, World Philosophy, Studies in Logic, and etc. Anyway, Professor Song Qinghui is well recognized by the mainland academic circle of philosophy. So the time is for you, Song Qinghui. You can ask and question and make comments.
Okay, thank you, Professor Williamson, for your wonderful talk on conditional. And I would like to thank Professor Chen for giving me this opportunity to be able to communicate with Professor Williamson directly. Let me share my screen first. Okay. Okay. So, in the end of the talk, Professor Williamson leaves a question for all Chinese audience. And how do conditional work in Mandarin? Let me begin with this question and provide my answer to it. Consider the ways in which Chinese speakers express counterfactual. Chinese is sometimes described as a tenseless language because Chinese has no obligatory inflection marking over the absolute tense. However, Mandarin Chinese has relative tense to indicate prior or posterior temporal relationship, and relative tense can be realized by aspect markers In Mandarin, two-word suffix le and guo are used as realist as space markers to encode completion and experience, respectively. Okay, as you can see here. And okay, as shown in 1 and 2, le and guo function grammatically features they have a role in expressing counterfactuality. Say, 如果有了电，灯就会亮。要是你去过他家，就不会不注意他那豪华的家具。Okay, so if we take conditionals without such verb suffix as indicative conditional by default, such conditional are typically irrelevant mode, indicating the speakers don't know what had happened. Okay. On the other hand, relative tense can be achieved by using adverb such like 早 and 真的. Okay. 早 usual sense is to identify a time interval T2 containing temporal points prior to the specific moment T1 under discussion. However, when a conditional sentence contains 早 in his antecedent, 早 cannot identify a T2 prior to a T1. And the imaginativity in modify does not form a time sequence with T1. For some fixed space, which does not really reside on the time axis containing T1. Thus, it doesn't really point to an area happening. In the term of possible semantics, 早 point to some imaginality not in the actual world, but in some other possible world, thereby expressing counterfactuality. In the case of 真的, for example, suicide, 如果他真的想娶你，不会这样对你。In the case of 真的, when be used in the antecedent of a conditional, the proposition containing 真的 delivers the implicature that at the time of speaking, the imaginality described has not had its truth established. Okay. Okay. Another way to express counterfactuality in Mandarin is to use some lexical chunks like 早知道 and 要不是. They directly encode counterfactuality, as you can see in the example 4 and 5. 早知道你这样不负责，根本就不能让你担任这项工作。要不是听你说，我还不知道老王的工厂关门的前因后果呢。Okay. In addition to the above two types of counterfactuality generating ways, a special type of marker-free counterfactual can be found in Mandarin. 6. Okay. 如果太阳从西边出来，我一定嫁给你。Okay. The impossibility of the antecedent makes it a counterfactual. Besides, given salient contextual information, a counterfactual can contain an antecedent that is known to be contrary to fact, with no use of any special way introduced above. Such a counterfactual can be taken as a such a conditional can be taken as a counterfactual. However, when I write a mail to Professor Williams, and Professor Williams have this reply, and Professor Williams cite his a case in his book and say maybe 6 will be classified as an indicative conditional. So maybe I should use another case in reply, like this. Okay. 如果我是你，我很惊讶。Okay. Given 6 star contains neither lexical chunks mentioned above nor verb suffix or adverbs mentioned above, it seems that the context plays a role in expressing counterfactuality in Mandarin. Okay, and here I think I agree, Professor Williamson, that in Mandarin Chinese we do have two kinds of conditional. One is inductive and the other is counterfactual. But since, as I mentioned earlier, Chinese don't have, it's a tenseless language, so we don't call it inductive and subjunctive because these two rules are for the syntactic use. Okay, so in Chinese linguistics, they usually call it 为实句, meaning counterfactual. Okay. Now let's go back to Professor Williams' lecture on of counterfactual. Here's my questions. Okay. Is there any connection between the suppositional test and suppositional theory of conditional, which is developed by Amaldas, McKay, Edgerton, and Barker? Based on the similarity between supposition and if clause, McKay says to assert if P, Q is to assert Q within the scope of the supposition like P. Okay. McKay seems to provide a speech-aid suppositional theory of conditionals, and we can find similar saying from Edgerton and Barker. However, as mentioned in Professor Williams' book, Suppose and Tell, the role of suppositional procedure and rule is epistemological rather than purely semantic. And it follows that Professor Williamson's suppositional procedure and rule have little to do with McKay's theory. And I wonder if there are any relationship between these two. And my second question is, it seems that Professor Williamson take problems concerning conditional as a kind of epistemic problem. I wonder why. On the one hand, as mentioned in Suppose and Tell, Professor Williamson seems to take the issues pertaining conditional as an epistemic problem, which requires an epistemic solution rather than a semantic solution. Recall that in Professor Williamson's epistemicism of vagueness, the Torrent principle is taken as followable because it's generating various theoretic paradoxes. Here in his epistemicism of conditionals, if I may call it so, the suppositional procedure or suppositional test or rule is taken as not only fallible but also inconsistent. Okay, because we can derive a contradiction from it. In the talk, Professor Williamson does not explain the suppositional test further, so I think maybe some of audience would want to know further or more about this test. Okay. The third question is, on the other hand, I believe that many people will agree that our assessment of conditional is influenced by many things. However, it doesn't follow that since both semantic and pragmatic solutions fail to provide a satisfactory solution to problems concerning conditionals, epistemic solution is preferred. Okay, the problem might be that the concept of conditional itself is defective. The third question is, what's the main difference between Professor Williams' theory and the strict analysis of conditional? I think maybe previous slides, Professor Williams will agree his theory is very similar to strict analysis of conditionals. So maybe I skip this question. The final question is, when considering many difficult issues, I propose that we should learn from the viewpoint of conceptual engineering. Conceptual engineering aims at addressing problems in all kinds of disciplines through conceptual analysis. No doubt our existing concepts, including the concept of conditionals, are inherited from our ancestors. But are these concepts suitable for us? As time goes by, these ancient concepts should also need to be revised or abandoned. Kevin Sharp even claimed that philosophy is, for the most part, the study of inconsistent concepts. It's very radical. Okay, I see. If so, we should not be surprised that there are so many counterexamples to any semantic of conditionals. And I also write this question to Professor Williamson earlier, and his replies like this. The very extended use of natural language conditional with no special training to use them differently from usual. In the most rigorously context in modern mathematics and natural science indicates that they are not past their sell-by death. Okay, what follows is my reply. To my knowledge, Professor Williamson's view on conditionals is a kind of thinking outside the box. I mean, let's take his activities on mechanisms as an example. When considering kinds of semantic paradoxes, many philosophers and logicians try to revise their semantics of vague predicates because most people presuppose that the problem is semantics. Okay, but Professor Williamson questions this presupposition and argues for his astigmatism. Here, for conditional, I think many philosophers and logicians presuppose that the problem is either semantic or pragmatic, and try to either revise the semantic or appeal to conversational impactor like Paul Grice, or appeal to conventional impactor like Frank Jackson, try to resolve the problem. Again, Professor Williamson questions this presupposition and argue for his epistemicism. However, here I think they, including Professor Williams, seems to presuppose that we have a perfect conception of conditionals, and this is the presupposition that I question. Let me put it this way: as many will agree, we can use conditional to express many things, such like general statements, low-rise statement, as mentioned in I remember chapter 1 of Suppositional Test entail, and Professor Williams focus on the similarity between general statement and the conditional, and causation, and hypothetical thinking, definition, necessary or sufficient condition, and so on. Each usage has its own use condition. But when putting together, these usages are conflicting one another. If we take these conflicting use conditions as the meaning or intention of conditional, we will have an inconsistent, level defective conception of conditional. Okay, and I think I should stop here because I think I should leave some time to other audience. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, so thank you very much for those comments, and it's extremely interesting for me to learn more about how conditionals work in Mandarin, and I'm kind of encouraged by what you're saying, because it does look as though on the one hand we've the same basic cognitive distinctions are being marked in Mandarin as in English, but in ways that you brought out, the mechanisms for doing that are somewhat different from the ones in English, but in part because Mandarin is a tenseless language in the sense that you explained, and in particular about the example that you gave the sentence, which would be translated into English as "If I were you, I would be very surprised." The 6 star. So definitely in English that would be a counterfactual conditional, and in English you could certainly not express it with an indicative sentence like "If I am you, then I am very surprised." That sounds extremely strange, and I think the absence of mandatory tense in Mandarin it may be exactly what explains why in Mandarin the counterfactuals can sometimes just be conveyed by context rather than by any specific markers. And I think in the case of that sentence, maybe one thing that's going on is the kind of the very obvious impossibility of the antecedent. Although I think if I were to give a fuller explanation of examples like that, I think I would use the kind of processing that we're doing with the suppositional test to explain how such sentences can make sense. I should now say something about the 4 questions that you were addressing to me. So the question A was, is there any connection between the suppositional test and the suppositional theory of conditionals, which is developed by, among others, Mackey, Edgington, and Barker? So the suppositional theory is very different from mine because it denies that conditionals have truth values, and one great difficulty for the suppositional theory is that it doesn't really explain how conditionals can be embedded in more complex sentences, which they certainly can. So, for example, if you take the sentence, "Everything which would have dissolved if it had been put in water contained salt," there we've got a counterfactual conditional being used to restrict a quantifier, and it's very hard to see how that would work on the suppositional theory of conditionals. And I think that's why the suppositional theory of conditionals is not really at all popular amongst linguists and amongst philosophers of language who are strongly influenced by work in linguistics. I think it's not just a coincidence that it's called the suppositional theory, though, because I think what the suppositional theory is doing, it's reacting to a genuine fact, which is the central role of the suppositional test in our use of conditionals, and then it's trying to, in effect, read the semantics directly off the suppositional test itself, and I think it's, as it were, in effect, it's trying to deal with the implicit problem of inconsistency by not assigning truth conditions to the conditionals. But in my book, I argue that actually, even if you don't assign truth conditions to conditionals, you get into trouble with the suppositional test, because particularly when you look at uses of it where we're asserting conditionals themselves under further suppositions, which is, of course, something that we often do. And so I think that it doesn't even really succeed in doing justice to the suppositional test in its unrestricted form. And by the way, you were saying it would be useful for me to say a little bit more about the suppositional test. And I mean, of course, there isn't time for me to say very much more. But one thing, I could say in relation to this is, which is connected with the suppositional theory that I reject, is, for example, if we take if we apply the suppositional test to the question of, well, when do you accept a conditional or when do you reject a conditional? Let's take a conditional of the form, if X happened, Y happened, then if you apply the suppositional test, you suppose that X happened, and then under that supposition, you assess the claim that Y happened. And if you accept the claim that Y happened under the supposition that X happened, you accept the conditional if X happened, Y happened. And if you reject the supposition that, if you reject the claim that Y happened under the supposition that X happened, when you're, if you like, imagining that X happened, then you will reject the conditional if X happened, Y happened. And if you neither accept nor reject the claim Y happened, perhaps you're not sure, under the supposition, then you'll be equally unsure about the conditional. So that's another example, in addition to the examples with probability, of how it worked. Then your second question is about why I as we take the relatively unusual line of treating the problem of conditionals as a problem, an epistemic problem, rather than a semantic or pragmatic problem. And my methodology is actually the same both for vagueness and for conditionals, which is, so I don't think that you can tell straight away that there must be an epistemic problem and not a semantic or pragmatic problem. I think that the approach of linguists and philosophers who for a long time try to solve these problems using semantics and pragmatics, I think that was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. I don't think that they were in any way crazy or unreasonable to apply those approaches. But I think, at some point, in both the case of vagueness and the case of conditionals, I think that kind of approach becomes a degenerating research program, and you see that people are being forced into more and more complicated, and kind of ad hoc hypotheses about the semantics of conditionals, and that's very clear in the literature, and likewise into very complicated semantics of vagueness, and I think at some point it becomes reasonable to consider an epistemic approach because of the failures of the semantic and pragmatic approaches, and then we're both with vagueness and with conditionals. Once you take an epistemic approach, it's actually possible to give a much simpler account of what's going on. So I don't think that you can tell when you first encounter the problem that it's not, you can't tell that it's an epistemic problem. But I think, as it were, the failures of non-epistemic approaches provide evidence that actually the problem is epistemic, and then the possibility of giving much simpler theories along epistemic lines. Your third question was about the main difference between my view and the strict analysis of conditionals. And as you say, I think my view of counterfactual conditionals is very similar to, the overall semantics that you get at the end is pretty much the same as other people have offered. I think the big difference between my treatment and their treatment is that my my treatment is compositional, that I actually derive the strict conditional semantics from separate semantics for would and for if, whereas I think they treat the counterfactual conditional as just something as well unanalyzed. So I think my treatment is more explanatory, but I agree that the semantics that you get at the end are pretty much the same. And then your final question, which is about the conceptual engineering and inconsistent concepts, is so one way in which I don't agree with Kevin Sharp is that I don't actually think that the idea of an inconsistent concept, I don't accept that idea, because I think that the kind of theory of concepts that it involves is one which depends on a problematic version of basically the analytic synthetic distinction. So Sharp is assuming that it can be simply as it were a requirement of understanding certain terms, or if, or in his case he's interested in the word true, that you accept certain principles, and then if those principles are inconsistent, then you have an inconsistent concept. But I don't think that it's plausible that these principles are actually requirements of understanding. And in his case, when he's talking about the things like the liar paradox for the truth predicate, and I don't think anybody is kind of shows that they don't understand the word true if they think that there are exceptions to the disquotational principle. That's just a theoretical stance, and so I don't think it's an inconsistent concept. I think it's simply that, again, I would say the disquotational principle may have the status of a good but not perfect heuristic for reasoning about truth. And similarly, with conditionals, that the suppositional heuristic, it is just a heuristic. It's not something that you have to accept in order to understand the word if. And in fact, for reasons that I explain in the book, I think that parts of our practice are not actually in accord with the suppositional test. I think that when we use conditionals, for example, in testimony, passing them from one speaker to another, we're doing something which sometimes gives results which are not in accordance with the suppositional test. So I don't think that these heuristics are actually kind of preconditions for understanding, and in that sense, I don't think it's appropriate to talk about inconsistent concepts. But of course, it's certainly a problem for our practice that we have these inconsistent heuristics. But I think particularly the case of mathematics is a really good test of our ability to use these terms. And in mathematics, in a mathematical proof, you'll see the word if or the corresponding word in whatever language or notation is being used. See it over and over again, and so there are ways of using them which are basically maybe just restricted versions of the ordinary use, on which these are incredibly powerful ways of thinking. And and in particular in mathematics and logic, you can see the central cognitive importance of thinking under assumptions, under hypotheses or suppositions, which in ordinary life we do by imagining scenarios. And the word if is really just, or some similar word is simply what we use to articulate this kind of cognitively central sort of hypothetical thinking, and so I take it that this kind of suppositional test is really built into normal human psychology, and so I don't think that's something that's going to become obsolescent. It's just that if we use it in certain ways that we don't, if we, as it were, think about certain examples that we don't normally think about, just as when we think about the liar paradox, we can get into trouble, and so it's better that we have some more reflective understanding, to help us with those paradoxes. But I don't think that shows that the overall the practice just needs to be rejected, or that we need to kind of stop using conditional words and using some others, because I think we're always going to have this kind of capacity for hypothetical thinking, which is not just central in a lot in decision making, for example. It's also central in mathematics and natural science. So we need it. Okay, let me stop there and give people time to ask questions.
Okay. I invite Professor Wang Wenfang to give some comments and ask a question. Since he know a lot about conditional and counterfactuals. Actually, he himself also do his research about this podcast. So, Wang Wenfang, please.
All right, so it's my turn. Yeah. Hi, Tim. See, nice to see you again. Yeah.
And you, yeah.
Yeah, I have to confess, say from the beginning that I did not read your book. I have not read your book yet. So everything I will ask will just be based on what you talk about today. It's quite interesting for me to see how the way you defend the semantic of two kinds of conditional. But my focus will be on the indicative conditional. So I have several questions to ask about your defense of the semantic of indicative conditional. I will ask them one by one. So your view about indicative conditional is that indicative conditionals are just semantically, they are just material implications, right? But since there are so many counterexamples to these kinds of theory, you propose that we can explain these counterexamples away by appealing to some kind of heuristic, such as the suppositional test. So I think that's your basic strategy.
Yes.
Okay. So if that's the basic strategy, then this is my first question. Yeah. Now you use a supposition test as a strategy to explain away most counterexamples to your theory and many people's theory of conditional. But the strategies can be used almost by any theorist to defend his or her view about, indicative conditionals. For example, if one proposes that, indicative conditionals are just strict conditionals, they can also appeal to, suppositional test to explain away those examples against their theories. And even, I believe that even Stalnaker can, use suppositional test to explain away the supposed counterexample to his theory. So I don't see why appealing to the suppositional test favor your views especially. Yeah, that's my first question.
Yeah. Well, I think one reason is that the truth conditional, the truth functional account is much simpler than all these alternatives. I mean, and I think that is scientifically an advantage. So that is part of it. But something I didn't really talk about in this lecture at all is that I do have some proofs in the book that in a certain sense the truth functional reading is the best fit to the suppositional test. So I mean, there are different. This is not the only. It's a bit tricky to say exactly. What the how you'd consider the what the best. What it means to talk about something being the best fit. But I can show that if you a certain, which I think reasonably defensible view about the fit in terms of probabilistic judgments, that that does actually single out the suppositional the truth functional reading as better than any other reading. So I do have some things like that, and I think also in the case of Stalnaker's, this is more on in the case of the counterfactual conditionals. I think that that his theory has a lot of difficulty combining with a reasonable theory of wood, and I think that that's a kind of I think just by the ordinary methodology of compositional semantics, I mean, because there are all these sentences where wood appears with some kind of modal meaning, but not in the presence of conditionals, that you have to give some kind of account of how wood behaves, and then for technical reasons, I think Stalnaker is in a particularly bad position to do that because he always selects a single world, as unlike Lewis. But when we're talking about, with the example I gave of, she would never betray a friend, the wood is generalizing over both the actual world and over some kind of factual worlds. So, the wood has to, as it were, it has a domain with more than one world in it. And that doesn't fit Stalnaker's semantics, because his semantics demands that you always have a single selected world. And so I think, of course, that's more to do with the counterfactual side, but I think it's going to be difficult for him to give an adequate theory of wood. And then, but also, if you want to end up with something like this strict conditional reading of the counterfactual, you need to have the right theory of the simple plain as it were indicative conditional to combine with that. And I think you get kind of interference between his his account of, if you don't give just a truth functional account of if by itself, then you get into then if you give some more complicated account, that's also going to interact in ways that are likely to be unwanted with the semantics you give to wood. So those are some reasons why I think that the truth, whereas the advantage of another advantage of the truth functional account is that it interacts with the modal operator would in a very straightforward way and gives a sensible compositional semantics for the counterfactual.
Oh, okay. I predicted that, say, you would mention simplicity, say, in favor for the, say, material implication account of indicative conditional. I would also predict that, say, you would raise the question about how other accounts will, say, explain the function of the word. But let's suppose that you are right about, say, indicative conditional. So indicative conditionals are just material conditional. And let's suppose that you are also right about, say, how, say, those counterexamples arises. They arises only because we often use the so-called suppositional test, right? And, but say, the heuristic you mentioned is, say, only reliable. So sometimes it predicts wrong about it when it evaluates, say, the truth value of a conditional. And it evaluates it wrongly, mainly when the counterfactual has a false antecedent. So if you are wrong, say if you are right about the semantic, about indicative conditional, how come we, as the master of our language, how come we, as people who use conditionals every day, how come we say how come we don't come up with a simpler heuristic, such as say, say use the suppositional test only when you don't know that the antecedent is false. Well, if you know that the antecedent is false, then you will just say that, well, that indicative conditional is true. So how come we don't come up with such a simpler and more reliable heuristic?
Well, I think I don't think that is a simpler heuristic. I think that's a more complicated heuristic than the one that I was suggesting. But it's also,
it's more reliable. It's more reliable.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, I think we still have some clashes with the suppositional, between the suppositional test and the semantics. But I mean, for example, in the example I give with the lottery ticket, I mean, we don't know whether the lottery ticket is going to win or not yet. So that restriction wouldn't help. And I think the main, the reason that we have, I mean, of course, if we were simply concerned to get a to use the conditionals in a way which respected the semantics, if that was our only concern, then of course on the truth-functional semantics, if P then Q has the same truth conditions as either not P or Q, and so we could simply treat the conditionals like those kind of disjunctions, and then that would fit the semantics. But I think what that misses is that we have this capacity for hypothetical thinking that is extremely powerful, and using a lot of our cognitive resources, in ways which is where it's difficult to we couldn't manage without them, because we have this capacity to use our cognitive faculties offline in imagination, and that's very important for as in the examples of decision making and so on. And I think, as it were, what conditionals do to enable us to articulate information that we've derived by these offline applications our cognitive faculties. And if we we wouldn't be able to use conditionals to do that if we simply treated them like not disjunctions of like not P or Q and that sort of thing, because they wouldn't be connected with as well this kind of hypothetical thinking in the right way. And so I think the great advantage of the suppositional test is that it's so immediately hooked up to hypothetical thinking, and so we're extracting information from our hypothetical thinking, and it's the job of the conditional to do that. And I think it would be actually quite difficult to devise a better way of extracting information from these kind of this capacity for hypothetical thinking than the suppositional test, which is the most direct way of doing that. But of course, it does have these problematic side effects as well. I think it's when you think of the challenge not so much as fitting exactly to the semantics, but as enabling us to make optimal use of our capacity for hypothetical thinking, then I think the attraction of the suppositional test becomes clearer.
Interrupt you. I'd like to ask a question first. If I have time, you continue. Okay? Tim, you define metaphysical modality in counterfactual way. For example, if A is metaphysically necessary, then necessarily not A counterfactually imply A. A is metaphysically possible, then not necessarily A counterfactually implies not A. But I think the same definition also applies to logical truths. For example, you see, if A is logically necessary, then necessarily, if not A, counterfactually implies A. If A is logically possible, then not necessarily A counterfactually implies not A. So it seems to me that this definition cannot differentiate metaphysical truths and logical truths. What do you think?
So, I think if of course, if it's metaphysically necessary that A, if that implies the counterfactual, and then if it's logically necessary that A, if that entails it's metaphysically necessary that A, it will also imply the counterfactual. But the question is about the converse entailment. So if you have the counterfactual, if not A were the case, then A would be the case, so that not A implies, it counterfactually implies A. That actually doesn't imply that A is logically necessary, because counterfactual, the counterfactual implication, as it were, is just holds, because of as it were, the modal facts and in a general way, so that if you follow these kinds of semantics, there's nothing in the semantics that differentiates that as it makes it sensitive to anything more demanding than metaphysical necessity, and so the semantic connection that you get is between the, as it were, just what is true in all possible worlds, and it won't give you logical necessity, but so that you don't. I mean, there's no room really in the standard semantics for a category of of logical necessity that's more demanding than just metaphysical necessity, and you can see that if you just think about the necessity of identity, because it's if given that Hesperus is identical with phosphorus, then it's necessary that Hesperus is identical with phosphorus, but by the proof, and the proof should that will apply to all possible worlds. So you get in all possible worlds Hesperus equals is identical with phosphorus, but it's not a logical truth that Hesperus is identical with phosphorus because they're distinct names. And so I mean, my own preference is for making those kind of logical, so getting notions like logical consistency and so on. It's just like that they have to do with the actual sentences themselves rather than with the propositions that they express, whereas metaphysical necessity holds at the level of propositions.
Okay. Over. You can continue.
Okay, can I go back to the question?
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
Thank you. I agree with Tim that we often use what Tim calls offline simulation in our counterfactual thinking, or in our conditional thinking when we are using either indicative conditional or counterfactual conditional. But still, I think that a heuristic should be reliable. The reliability is very important for our applying for a heuristic. If a heuristic is not reliable at all, then we should just throw it away. And as human being, and we should not rely on such a unreliable heuristic. So I'm proposing that if we are really using indicative conditional as material conditional, and sooner or later we should come up with such a more reliable heuristic, such as when you know the antecedent is false, you just know that it's true. You go into the so-called suppositional test only when you don't know the supposition, the antecedent is false. Wouldn't that heuristic more reliable?
So, I mean, one thing, I mean, we can, we could use those things, but and I think but I think there would still be more cognitive cost to applying some kind of differentiated thing like that, and for example, in the one thing I would say is in general we don't have very much choice about what heuristics we use. So, for example, we in perception. We can't throw away our heuristics because they're built into our brain, and we have no choice. But of course, we can subsequently overrule judgments that we come to, by when we in cases of perceptual illusion, like the Muller-Lyer illusion, where two lines one line seems longer than another, even though we know they're the same length. I think, if you think about the way that for example, conditionals are used in natural science. Natural scientists have to use them a lot because they have to. When they're talking about what, when they're testing a hypothesis, they have to talk about what would be the case if that hypothesis were true, and so they're using conditionals, and it's kind of hard to see that they've really got into any trouble when they use conditionals. But I think it's a little bit like for example, with disquotational principles for a truth predicate. We know that in principle there is trouble with the liar paradox, but at the same time, we don't really have any better general test, a way of using the truth predicate than to use disquotational principles. Those are the best we've got, really, for almost all practical purposes. Although, but then we do know that we will get into trouble in certain cases, so there are circumstances in which we can't trust them. And I think that what we've in effect done is, in a lot of our practices with using conditionals, we're somewhat. Well, we just use them in restricted ways and maybe in restricted contexts or whatever, and don't get into trouble. It's really remarkable that in mathematics, mathematicians, as far as I know, have never got into trouble by using conditionals. But if you look at, if you look at what mathematicians are doing, they're basically using the standard natural deduction rules for a conditional, which of course actually do determine that it has the truth functional meaning. So I think that whenever it's the unrestricted suppositional test is kind of built into our human ways of thinking, which are, they're just part of our psychology, and we can't not use them, really, but being, as humans, but what we can do is simply reflectively learn that these ways of thinking can get us into trouble in certain situations, and so as it were, in certain circumstances, alarm bells can go off, and we can realize that something has gone wrong. But I think it's those circumstances where you get into trouble are they're really quite rare, and I think we're better off kind of just using our natural ways of thinking, but in principle with an awareness that they can occasionally lead us into trouble. I think another analogy which is maybe worth thinking about is for example in Kripke's paper, A Puzzle About Belief, he's talking about how certain principles of ascribing beliefs can get us into trouble in certain cases, like with puzzling Pierre and so on. And I think the principles that he's describing are basically they are heuristic principles for belief ascription in terms of what people say, and I think it would be very, very difficult for us in practice not to use those heuristics. I think we would find it psychologically almost impossible not to use those heuristics, and we would be, and if we didn't use them, we would be so slow in our kind of real-time processing that we wouldn't be able to take part in a normal conversation, or but at the same time, we just have to recognize that that these heuristics can, in principle, get us into trouble. In the book, one thing I do is, I also have a view about the role that heuristics play in paradoxes of vagueness, in the Sorites paradoxes, and what people call tolerance principles, I think, are basically heuristics, and I give some. So I can, in certain examples, you can actually calculate what the level of reliability of these heuristics is, and it is very, very high. It's like 95%, that sort of thing. And so, and part of the point of them is that they're very, very quick to use, and so in normal life, we just need ways of thinking that we can apply in real time, and so, and then, of course, sometimes on reflection, we realize that these kind of instinctive ways of thinking are getting us into trouble, and then we have to pull back. But I think if we try to simply not use the ways of thinking that come to us instinctively, and just do without them altogether, I think we'll find that psychologically almost impossible, and or so unwieldy that we would just be unable to function effectively.
The time is up. I think we should stop here. Also, there is a question from Professor Shandong in the box, but we have no time to answer it. Many thanks to Professor Williamson, Professor Su Qinghui, Professor Wang Wenfang, and all our friends attending these lectures. Let us meet together next Sunday, the final lecture of Professor Timothy Williamson on the priori. See you next Sunday. Okay? See you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.